My name's Esther Snippa from Speaker Hub. If this is your first time listening to our podcast, let me give you a bit of background. Speaker Hub is an online network of speakers, trainers, and moderators. In this series of podcast interviews, we feature some of our most interesting VIP speakers, and they talk with us about their expertise and projects, as well as share ideas with you on how to become a better communicator. Today I'm talking with Ken Molay, and Ken is a global expert on hosting webinars. He's been sharing his ideas on how to do them effectively for over 10 years. If you're new to webinars or have done a handful and need some advice on making them more engaging, Ken has a wealth of experience that he's going to share with us today. To start off, can you tell us how you got started with webinars?
I started out in the tech world initially as a programmer. I was a technical geek, and I moved from there into product management and product marketing, and spent quite a few years as a head of product marketing in a Silicon Valley software company. And I started doing webinars as part of that. Outreach, lead generation, making sure that people knew about our products, and it involved internal web meetings with our employees. It involved customer meetings where we could let our customers know about new releases and developments in the company. And of course, it involved trying to find new customers. And as I did more and more of that, I realized that I was recognizing and finding the things that worked well. And I also recognized that when we would have on guest speakers, whether internally from our own company or from other people outside, that they often had difficulty presenting well and effectively in the webinar environment because it is different from public speaking in a room. And I thought, there's a real need here, a niche that isn't being filled. People need to know best practices and what works in the webinar environment. And I thought, I can do that. And so I did. I formed my own company in 2004, and I've never looked back.
Well, I'd love to get into a little bit about those challenges in a minute, but just to start off, what do you find the most inspiring thing about using webinars to share ideas?
The most inspiring is just the ability for people to exactly what you said, share ideas with people that they couldn't do that practically with in other venues. It's just too impractical in terms of cost, in terms of logistics, in terms of time sink for people from around the world to fly somewhere and meet together. That's still a very useful thing to do, and I don't say that people should stop doing it, but when it's impractical and the ability to reach more people in more places is wonderful. One of my clients deals with teachers from around the world, and we regularly have webinars with people for their first time getting on a webinar. They're nervous, they don't know what it's going to entail, and then at the end of it, they're so excited that they were able to share concepts, to share experiences with like-minded people from other cultures who are interested in the same thing from all around the world. And that's a great feeling.
And I think it is surprisingly easy once you do get started with it, but there's obviously a lot of things that are different than presenting to a live room. What are some of the biggest challenges?
I think the first thing that people really see as a barrier is not getting visual feedback from their audience. You can't tell if your joke has gone over well. You don't know if you have smiling faces. You can't see people rolling their eyes and know that you need to move on to another subject. We always talk about presenters need to use their body language well and work the stage, but we often forget about use your audience's body language, get those feedback cues from them to tell you what you should do, and a good experienced room presenter learns how to do that either consciously or subconsciously. A webinar environment is going to lose those kinds of cues, and so you have to learn to work with other ones. How do you engage your audience and get feedback from them when you can't see them?
Well, how do you do that? So you can't really look out at them and be like, oh, this person is completely checked out. They're not even in the room anymore. They're in the kitchen. What do you do? How do you find out whether people are even tuning in?
The classic example was always when all of the web conferencing products started up, they all said, oh, you should run polls. Just do polls all the time, and you can give your audience a little something they can click in on, and they'll feel like they're actively participating. And I used that for years, and now I find people start feeling like they're lab rats in your experiment. And I want people to feel more engaged, and I want to get more constant feedback than having to do a break every now and then. And so I rely very heavily on typed chat, whether you call it chat or question and answer in a specific product. I try to constantly let my audience know that I'm looking at what they're typing. I split my attention between what I'm saying and what they are saying so that we can have that constant feedback back and forth. And I mention names as I'm talking. Oh, Judy just said that she's had a similar experience. That's great, Judy. Thank you. And just that little bit of recognizing an audience member, that's something you can't do in an in-room experience. If somebody says something, they interrupt you, and you have to stop, listen to them, and let them say whatever it is they were going to say. In a webinar environment, it's wonderful because you can instantly triage and pick and choose the things that you want to use for your engagement and interaction. And that is a very powerful tool if you use it effectively.
But then you kind of get maybe a little bit of a surprise, like it's a little bit unpredictable. You don't know what kinds of questions you're going to get. How do you work in surprising questions into the flow of your presentation?
What you're talking about is if you're taking questions verbally, if you're opening up microphones and you have to deal with that. If they're written questions and things are coming in, you can choose to, in most products, turn off the public display of messages so that other attendees can't see what other people in the audience are writing. And then you can pick and choose which messages you want to concentrate on and which ones you want to deal with. Oh, I see that Dave entered a question asking me about what are best practices. Great, I'll answer that. Whereas you notice that Bill said, I hate you and I can't stand this webinar product. And you just choose to ignore that. Nobody knows that Bill ever wrote that. So again, it's more powerful and more practical than an in-room presentation in that sense.
And how do you manage the flow of your webinars? How do you get people to interact and ask questions?
There are a number of techniques that I try to teach on this subject. One of the main things is to constantly think from the audience's perspective rather than your own. It's very easy as a presenter to see that you have a large audience with dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people who are listening to you. And you start saying, well, I'd like to welcome you all. Does anyone out there have a question? What you need to realize is from a single attendee's perspective, it's just them. They're sitting alone in front of a computer listening to you, and it feels like a one-to-one conversation. And so you need to address them in a singular, in an individual sense. Hey, I would love it if you would type in a question for me right now. What do you think is the answer to this question? Never refer to the group as an entire entity. That makes it much more powerful and much more directed towards each individual who's listening and makes them want to actively participate. The other thing I do is attempt to mention names, as I said before. As soon as somebody hears a name being mentioned, they become more attentive because what if you say their name next? And they want to be ready for that.
Okay, so do you ever directly question people in the audience? Like, for example, this Judy, and you say, oh, Judy, what do you think about this?
I do. One of the places that becomes the most useful is when you have people listening together in a room. Maybe you have a number of people gathered together. They're watching on a screen and listening over a speakerphone or over a central computer speaker. How do you address them as individuals? Then you can do exactly what you said. You pick one person that you know the name of in that audience. You say, hey, Judy, was that clear? Judy, is there a question about that subject? Look around. Does anybody have their hand raised for me? And then you engage and involve one person to act as the proxy for the other people who are there. And that can be a very good, useful interaction technique.
So you've just mentioned, oh, is anybody have their hand raised? Do you ever use webcams?
I use webcam occasionally. To do webcam well really involves a lot of extra considerations. I see people using webcam poorly all the time. Shot from a laptop with a built-in webcam sitting on a desk, and it's shooting up into the speaker's nostrils. That's not a good look for anybody. Yeah. Now that I've said that, you'll see it all the time. And you see fluorescent overhead lights behind their head. So when I use webcam, I have a backdrop set up behind me so people can't see my messy office shelves in the background. I have reflector lights on either side of me so that I don't get reflections into my glasses that I wear. And I have to worry about, am I going to use my nice, big, geeky-looking headset that makes me look like an air traffic controller, or do I use my shotgun microphone or the mic on the webcam, make sure that all of that's working? And then after all of those equipment and setup concerns, I'm always thinking about how do I look on camera? Am I professional? Am I holding myself with good posture in my seat? Am I waving back and forth in and out of the camera frame? Am I moving closer or farther away from the camera so that the focus is changing? All of these are things that are not natural by any means. And while we can get away with them in a casual video phone conversation with somebody we know and nobody cares, if you're doing a business to business webinar where this is your first introduction to the world, you want to look as professional as possible.
So are there any benefits to using it, or is it really just only if you absolutely need to, should you?
Oh, if you can do it well, it's extremely valuable. People love having that extra personal connection, see who's talking, be able to put a face with the name, and they like picking up on the body language or facial expression cues. Interestingly, I did a survey on this and found out that the things that people like as attendees are the exact things they don't like as presenters. Attendees want to see the facial cues. Presenters say, I don't want people to see my facial cues. If I'm rolling my eyes at a question subconsciously, I don't want people to see that. So it's a fine line, and it really deserves extra training and extra practice in how to present yourself professionally when you are on camera.
Okay, thank you. Ken, tell us about the most memorable webinar you gave and what made it so effective.
Those are two separate questions. The most memorable webinars are the ones that are disasters, that have problems. I think it's true for all of us. When you tripped and fell in school and everybody laughed at you, that stays with you the rest of your life somehow. And yet the good days where things just went well and you happen to know an answer in class, those get forgotten. So for me, the most memorable webinars are the ones where something bad happened. And I took that as a learning experience. It made it effective for me because I learned not to do it in the future. Have lots of backups. Now when I do a webinar, I have two separate computers. I have a really expensive power generator. I have two different phone lines on two different circuits. I want to really make it hard for the webinar to have a catastrophic failure.
So it's more than just one plan B. It's multiple plan Bs.
As many plans as you could put in place. In terms of one that was really effective, I'll go back to my own training. I give a lot of webinars on best practices and techniques. And sometimes people nod their head and say, yes, I guess I learned a few things. But one that I really found to be very effective and I got a lot of great feedback on was talking about making your presentations nonlinear. Don't just have an agenda and move from A to B to C to D and end up with a summary. Instead, let your audience guide you. What should we talk about first? Give them some choices. That's where polling really can come into its own. And say, I want you as an attendee to help control the webinar. Should we talk about this more? Should we talk about it less? How's my pacing? Should I speed up or should I slow down? Where should we go after this topic? And people love finding how they can use that to their advantage to really become more empathetic with their audience, so that we're all in the presentation together and it's not just a bunch of passive listeners being controlled by a presenter.
No, it sounds like you turn it into more of an interactive experience as opposed to you're just consuming a bit of information.
Yes, and what's fun is I was able to use a lot of different techniques to show people you can do things using polls, you can do things using PowerPoint tricks, you can do things just with the way that you set up your presentation materials. There are a lot of things that people don't realize you can have more control over than you first learn when you're starting to use a presentation tool, either in PowerPoint or in a web conferencing package.
Ken, my last question for today is if you could offer one piece of advice to our listeners who might be presenters or public speakers who are looking to get into the field of webinars or have done a couple but could use a bit of advice, what would that advice be?
The classic piece of advice would be rehearse, and rehearse some more. But we all know that it's trivial. So let me use a different one, which is please think from the perspective of your attendee, not from your own perspective. What do they care about? What are their priorities? What did they come to hear about? Are you delivering on their expectations? Are you setting up their expectations properly just when you start with your advertising, promotional, invitations, whatever it is? Make sure that at all times you are addressing your subject from the perspective of the people who are listening to you rather than from your own selfish perspective.
Stop being selfish. And how will that?
That's actually a phrase that I use all the time, which is the exact opposite. You're selfish. Your audience is selfish. That's not a bad word. Embrace that selfishness. Realize that everybody cares about what they care about. We're human beings. We care about our own needs and interests. And if you can grab onto that and understand what your audience's interests are, what they are selfish about, that's going to make you the best possible presenter.
Wow, that was a fantastic insight. So thank you so much for speaking with me today, Ken, and sharing these ideas.
It's been my pleasure. This has really been fun, and I hope that you got something out of it.
If you'd like to learn more about Ken and how to give engaging webinars, please visit our blog at www.speakerhub.com. Until next time, this has been Esther Snippa with SpeakerHub.